Hello, I'm Kenneth D. King. A lot of people ask me about marking fabric, so I'm going to be introducing you to this marvelous little tool. This is what is called the dual tracing wheel or the double tracing wheel. When I was studying pattern making, the teacher that I worked with always had us draft stitching lines. We never added seam allowances. And at first I thought, how do you get this onto the fabric? So she introduced me to the dual tracing wheel, and I thought this was going to be a monumental waste of time. But she explained to me that if you have a marked stitching line and you pin the marked stitching lines together and you sew on the marked stitching line, you have a more accurate read of your pattern. So any fitting issues or any other issues are not related to construction, they are related to the pattern. This is the dual tracing wheel. When it ships from the factory, they're turned like so. So what you want to do is you turn them and you can set these wheels closer together, further apart. I tend to set it on the widest width because I like a wide seam allowance. So this is the dual tracing wheel, and here I have a pattern piece with the stitching lines marked on some fabric. When you're pinning, unless you're using silk, then you would pin in the seam allowances, but for most other fabrics, I pin inside the stitching lines so that I can get the carbon paper in. So now, a little talk about carbon paper. This is carbon paper that you can get through various sources. It's a very long sheet, it's a little more waxy, it sticks to the fabric better. I am careful about which fabrics I use this on, but it's really, really a good durable carbon paper. But the drawback for me is that it isn't a large sheet. Some people roll the huge sheet out, they lay the fabric on, they put another huge sheet on top, they put the pattern on top. That's not really something I like to do because I feel that it gets too much of the carbon onto the fabric. So my workaround is to cut a slice off. And if you cut a slice off, that's about 5 or 6 inches wide, and then you fold this in half and split it. This is what I regard as a really good working length for most pattern pieces. Now, another little trick, because I tend to be economical in certain ways, so what I like to do before I use my carbon is to put the cellophane box tape on the back side of the carbon. This way, if you're working on a thick fabric like a flannel or a velvet, you don't end up shredding the carbon paper before you get your marking done. Now, how this works, we have our fabric right sides together. We pin the pattern on the fabric. We slip one piece of carbon underneath the fabric, and we slip the other piece of carbon underneath the edge of the pattern, and then giving pressure on both edges of the handle. Now, if you want to use one tracing wheel, I have found the best way to do that is to turn one to the side. You can choose to run it this way or this way. But if you take this one off and lay it on the table, it always ends up in the trash, then you're missing a wheel. So as we're working around, we just move the pieces of carbon around as well. There we are. Take the carbon away, and magically you have a stitching line and a cutting line. Now, if you notice over here, you can see the stitching line, the cutting line is a little bit light. That's okay. If you want to err on the side of which wheel you give more pressure to, because some people have a little bit of a difficult time giving even pressure to both wheels. You lean into the wheel that's going to mark the stitching line. You can always go back later and with the chalk mark where the cutting line was not quite so clear. This, I think, is the secret to my sewing. I had a student comment one time saying, "You don't rip out much, do you?" And I remember being puzzled by that, and I asked her, "Why do you say that?" She said, "You sew with very short stitches." And I realized it is because I have a marked stitching line and a marked cutting line, and I pin the stitching lines together. You can also baste, and when you sew your stitching lines together, you get a more accurate result. I'm Kenneth D. King for Threads Magazine.